The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, the world is full of all different kinds of people that speak all different kinds of languages. Where did they all come from?
That's a good question, but the Bible does tell us.
All right, well, we'll talk about that this evening. Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. With me is Trevor Campbell. Trevor, please introduce yourself and the brethren in Payette.
Yeah, sure. My name is Trevor Campbell, and I do preach over in Payette. I worship with the church that meets there on Highway 62 in Payette. We meet on the north side of the highway next to the new Dollar General, pretty easy to find. And you will see on the screen there a phone number. That's my number. Now you can call me there if you have a question about the church that meets there, or a Bible question, a question that you'd like Keith and I to discuss on this program. Give me a call there. It's 870-435-2737. And also on the screen you'll see our meeting times of the Payette Church of Christ. And we meet on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. for Bible class, 10:45 a.m. for worship service. And so if you're in the Marion County area, come out and join us. We'd love to have you.
So you folks in Marion County, visit there with the Payette Church of Christ, and also let Trevor know what your questions are so we can talk about those on the program. Your questions generate the subject matter on this program. Of course, I'm Keith Sharp. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. We meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning for Bible classes, and at 11 o'clock for our worship assembly, and at 2 o'clock for another worship assembly on Sunday. We have a Wednesday evening assembly at 7 p.m., and we have a ladies' Bible class that meets at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. To get to the Highway 5 South Church of Christ building, then you just simply turn south off of the Highway 62 412 bypass on the way to Salesville, 1 mile south on the left. Go past Good Samaritan on the right, and then look for our sign, the Highway 5 South Church of Christ, 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass. We invite you to come to our services. We would be delighted to have you, and we believe that you would be benefited by having been there. Now, if you have a question for me, then you can contact me, Keith Sharp, by calling 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp2021@gmail.com. Or if you prefer to write a letter, you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. Let us know what your questions are so we can answer them on the air. Our question this evening is, how can two people, Adam and Eve, populate the world? Everyone looks different and talks different. Well, all right, let's talk about that. Trevor, go ahead.
All right, that's good. Yeah, just to get it started, first of all, yes, Adam and Eve, being the first man and woman on earth, did begin to populate the earth, and God had commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. In fact, it's in Genesis chapter 1, and beginning in verse 28 there, says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on it. And see, I have given you every green herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be food." All right, so he tells them, Adam and Eve, to be fruitful and multiply, and also gives them their diet there in verse 29. Well, that was the first time around that the earth was populated, but what we do have to remember is that in Genesis chapter 7, the great flood came. God brought a flood upon the earth, and that changed everything, because after the flood, there was only 8 people left. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. And so you've got 8 people total there. And so it starts all over again. But it's very interesting that when they come out of the ark, Noah and his family, God gives them the same command that he gave Adam and Eve, and he also gives them diet requirements, if you will. In chapter 9 of Genesis, in verse 1, it says, "So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." That's Genesis 9:1. And then in verse 3, immediately after that, he says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. And I said diet requirements. It's not requirements, but it's just what God has now authorized, I should have said earlier, what he has authorized them to eat. So in both instances there, we have this command to be fruitful and multiply. But also in the same chapter of Genesis chapter 9, the Bible distinctly says that it is from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah, that the earth was populated. That's in verse 19. It says these three were the sons of Noah, and previously talking about Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And from these the whole earth was populated. And so this is the second time around. The first time around, yes, it was Adam and Eve, but then you end up with just 8 people after the flood, as everyone else dies in that flood, is killed. And so all you're left with is those 8 individuals. And so it starts over again. But since the question did deal with Adam and Eve, let's talk a little bit, before I kick it back to Keith, in Genesis chapter 5, excuse me, this populating of the earth, the first time around, so to speak, with Adam and Eve and their descendants. Chapter 5 of Genesis is really spectacular because it shows the genealogy from Adam all the way to Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, those men that got upon the ark. And you're going to see some very astounding numbers here as far as the longevity of their lives. It was very great at the time. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read just a portion of it just to get an idea here of what's going on. In chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, "This is the book of the genealogy of Adam, in the day that God created man. He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them and called them mankind in the day they were created. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters." Now, I think it's very important to know, talk about populating the earth here, and how many people were, on the earth at the time of the flood, which we don't know, but we know there was a great many. You'll notice that as it goes through the genealogy, it talks about only one bloodline. It just follows one bloodline. And yet it says that he had sons and daughters. And they're living hundreds of years. And, I don't know about the women folk, but for the men folk, certainly the childbearing, the span in which they could bear children or have children was very long. And you can see that actually in this text. In fact, it's later on that it speaks of Noah, who had children around the age of 500. So this is pretty astounding. But they had sons and daughters. And in verse 5 it says, "So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died." And so it goes on from there, and they had sons and daughters. Now, these numbers seem very, pretty amazing. And, some people are skeptical about it and say, well, the year must have been smaller. They considered years to be smaller. But what we have to consider is that Moses wrote the book of Genesis. And when Moses wrote it in his day, he wrote it so that the people could understand it, what was going on. He's making a record of the history as an inspired prophet of God. And in Moses' day, the Hebrew calendar had 12 months. And it was very, very similar to our calendar, very, very close. Their month consisted of 29 and a half days. And so you can see very, very close, a little shorter than our calendar, since each month only had 29 and a half days. But what they would do is, even though they had 12-month years like we do, every 3rd and 6th and 9th and 11th and 14th and 17th and 19th year, each one of those years, they would add a 13th month, another 29 and a half day month. And that 19-year cycle would continue and come back around over and over. And so every few years, they're adding a 13th month to their year. Well, if you do the math, it's very simple. Every 19 years, they're about 2.5 days off from our calendar today. So very, very close to our calendar. Almost identical, really, and really insignificant amount. 2.5 days every 19 years is all that it differs from us. So when you look at these numbers, Moses wrote this to be understood in the years that he's talking about in his day, which is only, again, a couple days off from our years. And so these years are accurate. There's an incredible longevity in life here. Now, you'll see after the flood that it begins to dwindle. After the flood, people are still living a great deal of time, great many years, but it starts to go down very quickly and dwindles very quickly. Now, the only thing I can say is the Bible does talk about two different aspects that changed. One is the flood itself. In chapter 7, when you read about the flood in verse 11, God talks about the opening up the windows of heaven and also breaking up the fountains of the deep. The earth changed forever in that flood, and the entire earth was covered in water. And so you can imagine the magnitude of that storm and what it would cause and the change in the atmosphere. But also, not only that, but the diet changed as well, as we saw there. And so maybe those are factors in the man's life being shortened. But nonetheless, we're not told. But in any case, that is a picture there in chapter 5 of Genesis of the longevity of man's life, how they had sons and daughters. And so by the time the flood comes, there's really no telling how many people were on the earth. There had to have been a great many people upon the earth because of the longevity of life. All right, Keith, I'll kick it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. Appreciate you beginning that good discussion. Now, the question before us, I'll remind our audience, is how did all the different people, who, of course, do not look alike in some ways, now in some ways that we all do look alike, but in some ways we're very different from one another, and we speak all different languages. How did that come about from just two people? Well, of course, as Trevor has pointed out, actually it came about from 8 people because all except the family of Noah died during the flood, and so that left Noah and Mrs. Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, 8 people, from which all people living today came. So that adjusts the question just a little bit, but it's still in Acts. Well, before I go to Acts chapter 17, I want to go to Romans chapter 3. Now, really, the Bible does answer the question, and the answer is plain and simple, and it's very believable. But whether it is or not, there's an attitude we must have towards what we have revealed in the Bible and things that we see around us. Sometimes we don't understand, and there seems to be a contradiction, though there's not really such a contradiction. Of course, that's particularly between the Bible and science. Some people may think there's a contradiction. There's not a contradiction. Those contradictions are sometimes only apparent, but they don't really exist. But in Romans chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, the Apostle Paul gives us the attitude that we must have toward God's Word. For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you're judged. Now, what God says in His Word, the Bible, may contradict what you hear from learned professors in universities. Well, who's right? Let God be true and every man a liar. God is always right. God cannot lie. Men can and do lie. Men are often mistaken. God knows everything. He cannot lie. He will not lie. We must always have faith that God's Word is correct. And so to begin with, that's the attitude that we must have. Now, another attitude that we must have toward this specific question of how did all the different kinds of people get here from just 2 people or from just 8 people. Go to Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul is addressing a group of philosophers in the city of Athens, Greece, which was the home of philosophy. It was the cultural and educational center of the world in the Apostle Paul's day. And he's talking to people who are unbelievers concerning the one true and living God of the Bible. Notice what he says. I'm going to begin in verse 24 and read down through verse 26. God, who made the world and everything in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, seeing He gives to all life and breath and all things. Now notice carefully. And has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined the times before their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. God made one couple from which all the nations of the earth have come. All mankind are kinfolks. We're all one bloodline. We all came from Adam and Eve. We all came from Noah and his wife, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. Well, actually, we came from one of those three couples that were the descendants of Noah. All mankind are kinfolks. We're all descended from one bloodline. When we have fusses and wars, those are family wars because we're all kin to each other. Well, how is it that we have all these racial differences as men like to think of them? Actually, there's one race, and that one race is mankind. But how is it that we have all these differences in physical appearance and all these differences so far as languages? Well, actually, Genesis answers, and Trevor made a good beginning on this, Genesis answers both of these questions. Go first back to Genesis chapter 10. And in Genesis chapter 10, it tells us the nations that descended from Noah and then from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it tells where they settled. So there are three broad groups of people. By the way, if you study anthropology, if you study sociology, if you study the different groups of people throughout the world, even secular scholars that have no belief in the Bible will divide mankind into three groups of people. And this is exactly how the Bible does it. In Genesis chapter 10, where it shows us the places where Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their descendants eventually settled after they left the ark. And generally speaking, the descendants of Shem, Semitic people, settled in the Middle East. Generally speaking, the descendants of Ham settled in the Middle East or in Africa. Generally speaking, the descendants of Japheth settled in Europe and even in Northern Europe. Well, those are the three general bloodlines that come from one bloodline, Noah, that goes back to one bloodline, Adam and Eve. That's the general bloodlines that sociologists recognize on the earth today. The Bible said that all the way back in Genesis 10, through Moses, before mankind in general knew any such thing, it existed. Three general bloodlines of people. From those, all the different characteristics physically people had. But what about the different languages? Well, there's a story. It's a true story that is recorded in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. How that all the people of the world wanted to settle in one place, though God had told Noah to be fruitful and multiply and populate the earth. They were to go everywhere and repopulate the earth that had been destroyed. The population had been destroyed by the flood. And so they were to repopulate, but they were disobeying God. They wanted to stay in one place, and they built a great tower, we call it the Tower of Babel, where they were to be a monument that would keep them unified in one place. And God divided their languages, miraculously so that they could not understand one another. And so they drifted apart by language groups. So there you have, in Genesis chapters 10 and 11, the different physical characteristics of people from three bloodlines that eventually go back to one bloodline. Remember, we're all kinfolks, and where all the different languages came from. Rather than that being a problem with the Scriptures are the place that plainly explain the problem. All right, Trevor, I'm going to stop there and let you go ahead.
I thought that was good. You know, I was looking at something, Keith. Let me ask you something here. In Genesis chapter 10 there, you're right in that context there. Verse 25, Peleg?
Yes.
It says, for in his days the earth was divided. Is that
Right.
Talking about chapter 11? That's what I believe it is talking about.
Well, that's a possibility. There's another possibility. And see, again,
Okay.
It's something that says is unrevealed. We don't know about it today for sure.
Okay.
And certainly it could be the Tower of Babel. Another thing to be talked about is that what we know from geology today, that it appears that all the landmass of the world was once together in one place, and I believe that there was the drift of the earth that perhaps followed the flood. Now this is partly speculative. It cannot be proven, so I'm not sure about this. But if perhaps in the days of Peleg, that this physical breaking apart of that original landmass from which all the different continents came as they are today. And of course, sure, there's still continental drift even today, as we know from geology. And so that may be the explanation, or may be, just as Trevor has suggested here, that it's the divisions of languages. But those things did occur. And the Bible gives us a very brief explanation of these things, because that's really not what the Bible is concerned about, but it does tell us the answer to those things.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Okay, go ahead, Trevor.
Well, you were talking about, what people call different races. We're all of one race, but as far as different appearances, and that was part of the question, I believe, was,
right.
Everyone looks and talks differently, and certainly there are a number of passages we can go to talk about how God does give us specific talents, abilities, a unique personality to each person, and of course appearance. And it's in Genesis chapter 25 where a pair of twins are born, Jacob and Esau. And this is going to be the children of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac is Abraham's son. Rebekah is Isaac's wife. And Jacob is going to be Israel. His name is going to be later changed by God to Israel. But she gives birth to these twins. And it's in, I'll begin reading in verse 24. This is Genesis 25:24. It says, "So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents." So you're talking about two very, very different individuals there, completely different in personality and the things that they're into, if you will, and the things they like to do. But the appearance right away, the first comes out hairy and red, like a hairy garment all over. In fact, later on in chapter 27, in verse 11, Jacob talks to his mother. He says, "And Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, 'Look, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth-skinned man.'" So quite different in appearance, yet the same parents. And they're twins, they're born on the same day, same time, yet a very, very different appearance. And of course, we can see that sometimes in our own families, or you may know of a family where appearances, are really varied within the family. And so it's not, too far fetched to understand these things that, the Lord, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as Keith has shown, it may very well be that Ham had darker skin, possibly, and maybe married one of darker skin. When you get into the old genealogies there, the ancient genealogies, chapter 5 of Genesis, chapter 10, and then chapter 11 actually gives you more years as far as how long people were living and who begot who and when they begot them. But they married their own relatives. And that may sound strange or twisted in our day, but they married within the family. Well, that's all there was, especially at first. That's all you had. They married within the family. In fact, it's quite a few generations down, but Abraham, he married Sarah. Sarah was his sister. They had the same father, different mother, but it was his sister. And so, they married within the family. So if Ham married a darker woman, then one of his sisters, then you're going to have a darker skinned branch in the family there. Jeremiah chapter 13. Jeremiah chapter 13 and verse 23. It's just a real brief passage. But God says through Jeremiah, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard its spots?" So the translation here is Ethiopian. Whether that's really accurate or not, it really doesn't matter. The term in the Hebrew language that was used there is the word Cushi. And what it literally means is a descendant of Cush. Well, Cush was one of the sons of Ham. All right, so Ham he had Cush, and Cush apparently had a entirely different skin. So much so that the Bible brings it up here, and makes a comparison with the leopard and its spots. Can the Ethiopian or can the Cushi change his skin? And so this is a reference to a darker skin. much darker skin. And so yes, there was varied, even in those days, in the ancient times, there was already a variance in the appearance of individuals. And of course, just a simple example of that is Jacob and Esau, I think. Keith?
Very good, Trevor. You know, if our the people who are watching the TV program, if you want to see this genetic variation within family confirmed, then watch a litter of kittens. And what you might have 6 or 7 kittens at one time, and they might have every different color, every different physical characteristic that a cat can have in that one litter of kittens. There's genetic variation. And over a length of time, as they're divided from one another, that might be more pronounced in one bloodline than it is in another. That appears to be what happened with mankind. As mankind divided after the flood, after the Tower of Babel, went their separate ways. There were different physical characteristics already, and they became more pronounced over time. And of course, languages came about right there in Genesis chapter 11. So there's the simple answer from the Bible. But I want to go back to something that I said at the very beginning. Even if this is something that gives you problems in understanding how it came to be, how it came about, then remember God's Word is always right. And if God says in Acts chapter 17 through the Apostle Paul that from one blood came all the nations of men, and of course that goes back to Adam and Eve, it goes back to Noah and Mrs. Noah. If that's what God said about it, then that's what I must and will believe about it, because I believe there's clear evidence that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and as such, let God be true and every man a liar. Well, Trevor, we have a couple of minutes left on the program, and really I've said what I would like to say about that question, so I'm going to let you let you finish up the program if you would like.
All right. Well, you know, the first part of the question was, how can 2 people, Adam and Eve, populate the world? And I think we showed that they did, but then all those folks died off in the flood, but then the 8 people that came out of the flood, came out of the ark, they repopulated the world. And, you know, it's interesting. You can actually go through the Bible, and if you got a calculator, and do some simple math and do some simple addition, but you can look at the genealogies. Beginning in chapter 11 of Genesis, you can add up the years in between men's lives, and then you can go to chapter 47 of Genesis, when the people entered the land of Egypt, when Jacob entered Egypt. It's chapter 47 and verse 9. He was 130 years old when he came to Egypt. And you add up these numbers, and then you add up the fact that God says in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 41 that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. That was the years of their sojourn, the Bible says. And then there's another text in 1 Kings chapter 6 in verse 1 that says that Solomon began to build his temple 480 years after the children of Israel came up out of Egypt. Well, it's very simple math. You just start adding all of these things up, and we know from secular history that Solomon's temple was, the beginning of it was started in 967 BC. And so you can add all of these numbers up. To make it short, you add these things up, it comes down to 4,480 years from the time that Noah and his sons came out of the ark until our day today. Well, you look at that time period, and you can see in over 4,000, almost 4,500 years, that yes, easily the earth could be populated. Think about in the last 1,000 years how much the earth has increased in population. Well, now look at 4,480 years. That's a long time. So that may help some folks to answer that question. And these are all things you can look up for yourself, and just, if you got a calculator, add it up. But if you have any other questions about this, please let us know. And we thank you so much for watching this evening.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.